Hello and welcome to this episode of India and the World on DeKoder. I'm Nidhi Razdan. As we speak, the ceasefire, the rather precarious ceasefire between the United States and Iran seems to be completely unraveling. In the last few minutes, Donald Trump has also told Fox News that the Strait of Hormuz will be taken over by the United States, which will then charge countries for using it. There is utter chaos at the moment on the status of the Strait of Hormuz, through which much of the world's oil supplies and gas supplies pass, because the Iranians say they've completely closed it off. The Americans till now have maintained that it's open. Now Trump is talking about the Americans taking it over. There has been, over the last few days, several rounds of firing from both sides, from Iran on ships passing through the strait, by the Americans on Iran. Iran also attacking American military bases in the Middle East at the same time. Now, all of this has led to serious concerns that a very precarious, as I said, peace deal that was signed between both sides just under a month ago in France may actually completely unravel. And to talk us through what to expect and what the next few weeks could look like is Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President with the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in Washington, D.C. He is an Iranian-Swedish writer, political analyst, and knows this story better than anyone else. Thank you very much, Mr. Parsi, for
Thank you
joining
so
us.
much for having me.
Let me ask right off, uh, is this peace deal ceasefire effectively over, or do you think it's still going to hang on by a thread?
I think it is effectively over for now. I think the outcome of this military action will frankly be indecisive. We're not going to see a result coming out of this that fundamentally changes the realities on the ground and breaks the deadlock over the strait. So they're going to have to come back to the negotiating table. It's going to be very difficult because trust is really non-existent at this point. And at that point, the question is, are you going to start off from scratch or are you going to start off from where you left it off with the MOU? Perhaps some changes will be made to the MOU, but the fundamentals of it, I suspect, will not change because I don't see the US having the time to be able to do the military degrading of Iran as it desires to do. You have to keep in mind, oil inventories are at a much lower level globally today than they were back in February, which means that the United States, as a result, has a much shorter runway before it needs to wrap up this war, before you have the oil crisis reemerging and probably in a worse shape than it was last time. Moreover, you're only 16 weeks away from the midterm elections, whereas back in February, the administration genuinely believed that they had time to be able to conduct the war and then time to be able to clean up the economic aftermath of that. That is extremely difficult to do at this point. So we're talking about achieving a better military outcome in a much shorter time period than last time around with worse starting conditions.
We're already, in fact, seeing all of this uncertainty over the last few days affecting international oil prices, which have gone up. But can I ask you, what do you think has immediately sort of provoked this unraveling? Is it that Iran believes that it has this leverage now over the United States and the rest of the world, really, by controlling how ships pass through the Strait of Hormuz? Is it leverage? Do the Iranians see that? What is it that has led to this escalation again?
So there is a narrative out there that says that essentially the Iranians are overplaying their hands. They're trying to extract more concessions from the United States. And that's why they took a very hawkish position in the talks about the Strait of Hormuz. I lean towards a different explanation based on conversations I've had with folks on all sides throughout all of this. The Iranians have, for the last couple of weeks, become convinced that the United States was intending to restart the war, and that it was using the MOU to win time, restock oil supplies and inventory. And there's several different reasons as to why they have come to that conclusion, rightly or wrongly, including the dramatic shift in rhetoric from Trump. We just saw another example of it today, calling these people scum, talking about how he wants to finish the job. We're talking about the release, making it public that the US has essentially threatened Iran and said that Iran has to come out and say that the strait is open and take responsibility for what has happened so far. That is actually a pathway that potentially could have worked, but once it was leaked and made public, it really reduced Iranian maneuverability at the negotiating table, and the Iranians were looking at that and saying either this is explained by Trump's desire to look tough, or it actually is a deliberate sabotage effort to make diplomacy as difficult as possible. I personally think that some of those conclusions on the Iranian side are erroneous, and they're assuming the worst, which is understandable given the circumstances that they're in. But bottom line, these different developments, combined with, of course, what we saw in Israel and Lebanon, in which the US mediated an agreement that essentially violated the MOU and enabled Israel to remain in Lebanon, as well as what has happened in the Strait, in which the Iranians suspect that the US has been trying to create a southern corridor that would remain open even if war resumed and even if the Iranians try to close the Strait, and by that take the leverage of the Strait away from Iran, which the Iranians believe was critical for them not being defeated in this last round of war. All of these factors have come together and caused the Iranians to conclude that the US was intending to restart the war. And as a result, they calculated that it was better for them to close the straits first rather than waiting for the US to attack.
I, so that brings me to the question, as you said, you believe that that conclusion that the Iranians may have drawn about the worst case scenario, you don't believe that that's necessarily correct. And I mean, again, I have to ask, as you mentioned, there are midterm elections in the US just 16 weeks away. Would Trump risk an escalation at this time, given how unpopular, deeply unpopular he is, this war is, the effect that it's had on gas prices in America? Does it make sense to you that the Americans would want to sort of regroup and hit the Iranians again at this time?
It does not make any sense to me whatsoever. That doesn't mean that there may not have been the intent of the administration to do this. My disagreement with the Iranian calculation is that unless you're 100% certain of this, you're taking a huge risk. And the risk you're taking is that you're creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. The administration may not have intended to go to war, but at this point, they're at war. So the Iranian actions have helped create a scenario that they intended to avoid. But of course, from their side, their belief is that the risk was so high that if they waited too long, they would be at a huge disadvantage. And as a result, it was better for them to close the strait before the US further escalated. We have to remember the US started bombing several days before the Iranians closed the strait. Bottom line is, if diplomacy was conducted in a more systematic and traditional way, I think this whole thing could have been avoided. I think the Iranians overreacted to some of the ships going through the strait. There's other ways for them to handle it rather than shooting at them. And I think the Trump administration overreacted by escalating as fast as they did militarily after the second round of ships being shot at. And that has then created a scenario in which they are now at war, even though that may not have been the intent of either side.
Would you also say that the fact that the memorandum of understanding or the interim peace deal that was signed in France in June had very vague, open-ended language, also particularly about the Strait of Hormuz? I mean, just to remind our viewers that before this war began, ships were able to pass through. Tankers were able to pass through with no charge, and everyone was happy. And now you have this situation where the strait is either closed or partially closed, and even within this MOU there is that very vague paragraph that talks about 60 days in which the strait will remain open, and then Iran and Oman will sit together and decide what to do with it next, including possibly charge a toll, right? So did, did that create its own problems, the language there?
It certainly is a vague paragraph. You're talking about paragraph 5, in which it does say that Iran needs to ensure that the traffic through the strait is safe, and that this is a reference to the fact that they need to do the demining. The Iranian interpretation of that is that all ships have to then coordinate with Iran in order to transit through the strait. Not a fee or anything like, but they just have to coordinate. Then that coordination is as simple as notifying that the ship intends to pass through, and that is necessary for the Iranians in order to ensure their safety and that there are no mines, etc. The American and the GCC interpretation, however, is not that this means that there is some sort of a mandatory coordination with Iran that is required, and rather believe that the Iranians can do that for their part of the strait and the part of it that has been mined, but not for the southern corridor, which is in the Omani territorial waters that has not been mined by the Iranians. But the Iranians fear that that effort is an effort to create this additional corridor that would remain safe and open even if the US starts the war again, and as a result, deprive Tehran of a very important leverage that it had that forced the United States to come to the negotiating table, at least in the view of the Iranians.
What would you say countries like India, need to do at this point? India's sort of been stuck in the middle, walking this diplomatic tightrope between initial support for Israel and then sort of trying to make up for that later. And for us, since most of our oil needs are imported, the Strait of Hormuz becomes very, very critical. So, is India's best bet to continue to negotiate with the Iranians on its tankers and keep those channels open? What can India do differently this time?
I have to say that India's approach up until this point has been a bit baffling to me. This rapprochement or almost this alliance with Israel, which really is a massive break with India's traditional posture on this issue, is baffling to me, and I think should be even more baffling to the Indians at this point, mindful of the fact that Israel pushed for this war with no regard whatsoever what the impact of this war would be on India and many other countries in Asia that are the primary purchasers of oil from the Persian Gulf. Israel itself is completely insulated from these consequences. And as a result, appears to have taken no consideration for how this will impact the others. And Modi was in Israel meeting with Netanyahu just 2 or so days before the war started. It's
That's
very
right.
curious. Either the Israelis informed India of the plans, and in that way, at least implicitly made India complicit, or Israel did not inform Modi of these plans, and that raises further questions of what kind of a one-way street this Israeli-Indian alliance actually has turned into. Going forward, I would suspect that India's best path forward is to make sure not to drag itself unnecessarily into the conflicts in the region by taking sides, similar to what the Chinese have done. The Chinese have stayed completely out of all of the different quarrels in the region. They're even more dependent on the Persian Gulf War than India is, or at least they were in the past. I think they have now shifted significantly. But they have managed to walk that tightrope without taking sides. India has not, and as a result is suffering more than what the Chinese are doing at this point. India should continue to have strong relations with Iran, both commercial, energy, without being dragged into any of these conflicts, and continue to have that relationship with Israel, with Saudi Arabia, UAE as well. But allowing itself to become a piece in that conflict, I think, is a huge mistake.
Finally, Mr. Parsi, what do you predict then over the next few weeks? I don't think anyone thought that this 60-day window that the US and Iran had given themselves to work on a peace deal was ever going to be 60 days. This could potentially drag on for much longer. But is it possible that you still have this kind of firing at each other that takes place and talks go on at the same time? Is that what you foresee happening, or do you think that we'll be back to full-fledged war?
I think, frankly, there is essentially full-fledged war at this point, particularly if the reports are true that the United States also hit oil installations at Kharg Island. That is one significant step beyond what it did before. And the Iranians will then escalate in turn. And that means targeting GCC oil installations, which will create a completely different level of energy crisis than what we've seen before. What we saw during the first war was a bottleneck problem, meaning oil was still being pumped out of the ground, but it was not getting out of the Persian Gulf because of the closing of the strait. If you have targeting of oil infrastructure, that means that you actually have a production problem. And the production problem will take much longer to resolve, meaning that oil prices will remain high for a much longer period of time. This will have a devastating effect on economies such as India's. So I think, unfortunately, we're already in a very bad situation. I think there will be simultaneous diplomacy going on to see if something can be done to bring the parties back to the table. And they will probably succeed, but this time around, it may take a couple of more days or perhaps even weeks before that happens. The question, though, is, will it fundamentally change facts on the ground so that when they come back to the table, given the fact that trust will be even more depleted, the situation is such in which a pathway to some sort of a deal is easier, or whether it's going to be much more difficult? I suspect that it will be more difficult.
I think these are very tough times ahead, as you've put it. Lots to track here. Thank you very much, Trita Parsi, for joining us
Thank you
and
so much for
giving
having
us
me.
your perspective on this big story. Thank you, and we continue, of course, to track these developments very closely. Do join us again in a few days as we look at what happens next in the U.S.-Iran story and how it impacts all of us. Goodbye.